Let's talk about self-esteem. Is it, as Albert Ellis used to claim, a myth or a sickness? An idea that does way more harm than good? Or is it, in the words of Nathaniel Branden, an essential psychological need? Not many days go by without me seeing a client coming in claiming that they think that all of their issues revolve around their level of self esteem. So who's right, Albert Ellis or Nathaniel Branden? In this particular video, given that I've been so heavily influenced by Albert Ellis and his rational emotive behavior therapy, and also the writings of Nathaniel Branden, I'm going to look at, based upon my 28 years of experience seeing clients, I'm going to look at what I perceive to be the strengths and weaknesses of their arguments, where I think they're both right, partially right, and also where I think that both of them are just flat out wrong. So let's start with Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis claimed that self esteem was a myth. He also claimed that it was a sickness. Now, of course, something can't be a myth and a sickness at the same time. But I think the crust of his argument was that the whole notion of self esteem did way more harm than good. His argument and the way he framed it was that self esteem essentially consists of rating not only your behaviors and your choices and decisions as good or bad or useful or not useful in a particular context, but also rating your being or yourself. And it's the latter, according to Ellis, which is the kind of thought distortion or thinking error that does way more harm than good. And Ellis would claim that we tend to engage in this sickness of self esteem with regards to two contexts or goals. So, one of them being, what I want to achieve and accomplish and experience. So people might rate their behavior again as good or bad or useful or not useful in a particular context in relationship to their studies or their work or their parenting skills or whatever it might be, and then rate themselves as good or worthwhile depending upon their ability to reach their goals, essentially. And also in the kind of social and romantic context, that people tend to rate themselves, their being, their total selves, based upon their success in mating or whether people seem to approve of them or like them or not. So essentially, if people approve of me and like me and I'm able to have good social relationships, that means that I'm worthwhile and therefore good as a person. Of course, the opposite being true as well, that if I'm not able to, evoke feelings of likeness or attractiveness or people approving of me, or then that somehow means that I'm not worthwhile or not good enough. And Ellis's argument was that as very fallible human beings, we're all going to screw up, both in the context of romance and social relationship, as well as the more professional aspects of our life with work and studies and accomplishments. And as a result of this tendency to rate ourselves, our being, and not just our behaviors, is actually something that contributes to a lot of our psychological suffering. This generates a lot of anxiety, a lot of shame, and also a lot of pride. Um, and he also claims that this tendency to rate ourselves instead of rating our behaviors and choices contributes to what Albert Ellis, tongue in cheek, called masturbation. The tendency to demand perfection, the tendency to think that I must achieve my goals. I must be respected or liked by other people, or life must be fair and just and not have too many hassles. That it's this masturbatory thinking that is at the root of so much of our psychological suffering, and that a big part of why we engage in this masturbatory thinking is because we rate ourselves globally as worthwhile or not worthwhile. We rate other people as worthwhile or not worthwhile, and we rate life globally, right? So what Ellis essentially championed with his rational emotive behavior therapy was unconditional self-acceptance, meaning that you can rate your behaviors, your choices, your ways of thinking, your strategies, your ethics, whatever, but that you can choose to accept yourself unconditionally, irrespective of whether you achieve at your goals or whether someone likes you. Or even better, you can choose to not rate yourself or being at all, but just rate what you're doing, right? This is a way of kind of separating the person from the behavior. I agree with Ellis on this. This is exceptionally healthy, if you will. If you can train yourself to only rate what you do and your choices and your decisions in a particular context, but not rate yourself globally. If you can do that, you'll have way less psychological suffering. You'll have way less anxiety and shame and tendency to depress and to get too angry and these sorts of things. And you'll be way less likely to then engage in masturbation. This tendency to think and believe that you must achieve your goals and that people must respect you and that life must be fair and just. And as a result of that, you'll suffer way less psychologically and likely have actually better performance and more fulfilling relationships. Not that it's a guarantee, but you're probably more likely to do that. Also, Ellis would also claim that this project of rating yourself is pretty much impossible because again, the self being a construct of sorts, and that our behaviors change. We do good things, we do bad things, we do kind of in between behaviors, and how would you rate this? And tomorrow we might change and do new stuff. And also, and I think this is an important point, if I rate myself as good or worthwhile based upon performing well or doing well, then obviously if I don't perform well or get acceptance, I'm going to rate myself as not good, right? And therefore I have to perform and I have to achieve and I have to get approval and all that sort of stuff. And the point that Ellis would make, which I think is also right, is that if I'm good fundamentally because I do good things, then it might be way more difficult for me to be willing to look at or accept or deal with feedback and information that kind of challenges or points out that perhaps I haven't been acting so good. Maybe I've been cruel or unfair or unjust, because taking that on board then would challenge my entire sense of self and be very threatening, right? So this is the rational emotive behavior therapy and Albert Ellis perspective then, is really training people to challenge their masturbation, their musts, needs, and their shoulds, and try to replace them with preferences and wants, and doing your best to achieve things instead of masturbating about it, and practicing unconditional self-acceptance, which would be to not rate yourself but only your behaviors and your ways of thinking. Unconditional other acceptance to rate what other people do and their actions and their decisions, but to not rate them as human beings, and also unconditional life acceptance that even if you may dislike certain aspects of life, that you can unconditionally accept life itself. Okay. Now let's look at Branden's Nathaniel Branden's orientation. When I was a young man, I was deeply influenced by the teachings of Nathaniel Branden, and this is before I discovered the teachings of Albert Ellis, right? So Branden completely disagreed with Ellis, and he said that self-esteem is a deep psychological need, that nothing's more important in life than the reputation that you have with yourself. And he would also correctly, in my opinion, point out that people's self-concepts, if you will. Now, Branden would he meant more by self-esteem than just self-concept, but most of people's challenges in life, their conflicts, their relationship issues, their neuroticism, their challenges with substances, what they put up with, the boundaries they set, what they aspire to, that this has a lot to do with how they fundamentally view themselves, their level of identity, their sense of worthiness. So for him, self-esteem was something completely real and an essential psychological need. And he would define self-esteem as a disposition to experience yourself as competent to cope or deal with the basic challenges of life, and the disposition to experience yourself as worthy of happiness. And of course, this is the aspect of it that Branden, no, that Ellis would challenge. Not necessarily the self-efficiency or your ability to be competent to deal with things in life, but this idea of being worthy of happiness, because that kind of implies that you may not be worthy, right? And if you're not able to, or you make poor choices, if you don't have an experience of dealing competently with the challenges of life, that then implies that you're not worthy of happiness. So now Branden claimed that self-esteem was a essentially had six pillars, and they're all basically different ways of pointing to the same thing. So the self pillars would be the practice of living consciously. Now, the opposite of living consciously would be to live kind of mechanically and to not think for yourself, to consistently evade facts and have a disrespect for evidence and reason, and to not want to know, to not want to figure out how stuff works, to not care about what's true or what's accurate. So living consciously is that kind of curious, active mind that really seeks to discover truth, that cares about evidence, that is willing to look at various aspects of life and wants to learn, and so on and so forth. The other pillars would be self-acceptance, refusing to be in an adversarial relationship to yourself, the willingness to kind of acknowledge and own your thoughts and your feelings and your inclinations. Self-assertiveness, that tendency to not suppress your values or your aspirations for the sake of conformity or social approval, but having the courage to sing your unique song in life, or to express what lives inside of you. uh, to actually, you know, be willing to live your values and explore what you want to explore on your terms, right? Self-responsibility. Of course, the opposite would be someone who points fingers and plays victim and holds society and other people primarily accountable for their lot in life, but someone who's willing to take responsibility for their own life, their own choices, their own decisions, to decide for themselves, their own values and that sort of stuff. Living purposefully, the kind of responsibility to formulate your own values and to try to live a life of meaning instead of just whims and drifting in the moment. And finally, the practice of personal integrity, which is basically, do you walk the walk? Is there alignment? Are you authentic? Or are you glib and fake for the most part? Do you do your best to live your values? Do you tell the truth? Do you honor your commitments? Are you willing to acknowledge your mistakes when you've been wrong? Um, these are Branden's 6 pillars, right? Now, if you look at the kind of argument here or the debate between Ellis and Branden, um, as I said previously, I think Ellis is right to do his best to teach people to only rate their ways of thinking and meaning making and behaviors and decisions, but to do their best to not rate their being or their selves. That's like, to the extent that you can do that, you're going to have a better emotional life. So that's a worthwhile teaching. Brandon's kind of counter argument would be that, but you can't avoid the reputation that you have with yourself. You can't avoid your own conscience, if you will. That it's not just a matter of rating. It's a matter of your very sense of self being deeply impacted by the choices that you make. So on Brandon's webpage, nathanielbranden.com, he has this article that says "for the record," where he kind of responds to Albert Ellis's criticism and also cites Michael R. Edelstein, who's a REBT-based psychologist who wrote this article in Liberty magazine, where he essentially says that, look, Branden makes the claim that if you act honestly and rationally and you're productive, then you can not only say that, okay, I coped well with the basic challenges of life, but therefore I am worthwhile. Brandon's argument is, I've never said anything about rating yourself or being worthwhile. His argument was this. His argument was that he took the example of physical health, where he said, look, if you're in poor physical condition and you experience often being fatigued, you have little stamina, you experience shortness of breath, you're physically weak, it's not really a matter of rating yourself. It's a matter of, the facts that you are in poor physical health. You have an experience of yourself as being in poor physical health, and the problem is that you are in poor physical health. And he would say that it wouldn't make any difference if I refused to rate my physical health. I would still be in poor physical health. So the rating here is not the issue. Now that kind of makes sense. But then he draws the parallel and he says, look, let's say you have a person who's constantly dishonest. There's a big gap between the values that he claims to have and how he actually lives. He disowns his own emotions and his own experience. He constantly evades facts and is hypercritical and plays victim, right? Well, that person is not going to trust their own mind to deal with the basic challenges of life. And as a result of that, they're not going to be able to respect themselves. And he would then claim that, look, if someone does the opposite, if they do their best to live consciously and practice self-responsibility and integrity and self-assertiveness and these sorts of things, then they will be more capable of coping or handling the basic challenges of life, and they'll have an experience of being so, and as a result of that, they will respect themselves as human beings. Now, again, I think they're both kind of right and both kind of wrong. I'll get back to the wrong part later. Um, well, here's the kind of right part of it, right? So as long as you experience, as long as there is an automatic identification with thinking, where it looks as if you are this autonomous, separate, permanent self, then yes, the way you live and the way you think, and whether you're in integrity or responsibility, you're going to have a reputation with yourself, most likely, and there will be psychological consequences of that, right? So I think in but at the same time, even if you have that sense of being a self, I think you can still train yourself to practice unconditional self-acceptance, to not rate yourself at all, right? So in this sense, I think they're both right. Now, somewhat ironically, Branden and Ellis were teaching a lot of the same stuff. Now, I would argue that one of the main criticisms that Ellis um, targeted towards Branden was that Branden's vision was very much a hero worshipping, vision of man deeply rooted in Ayn Rand's philosophy, and did not at all touch upon unconditional self-acceptance. It was a very conditional self-acceptance, right? But Ellis did a great job, I think, for the most part, in training people, educating people to live in accordance with these pillars. So Ellis, for example, in rational emotive behavior therapy, had this ABC model: A, activating event; B, your beliefs, what you think and interpret and believe; and C, consequences. And he did a great job in helping people to see that they largely feel the way they think. He would write this. He would write that people largely feel the way they think. That it's not the events in of themselves, but it's the events and our interpretation of them, our stories of what something means and what it means about us, and the motives we attribute to other people, and are we merely preferring or wanting things, or are we masturbating about things? So helping people to discover that they largely construct their own experience, they largely feel their own thinking, that's a great way of teaching people self-responsibility, right? It's a great way of teaching people to look at their own experience and look at their own stories. He did a great job in teaching people unconditional self-acceptance, right? And he would also encourage people to assert, their wants and to pursue their own goals in life. He would have a bit more emphasis on the social aspects of things. Ellis didn't talk that much about personal integrity, though, as a pillar, as Branden did. They were both very philosophically inclined. Branden, of course, was heavily influenced by Ayn Rand and Aristotle. You know, uh, Ellis was influenced by Greek and Roman philosophers and Eastern philosophers and Bertrand Russell and Karl Popper and postmodernism, and he had more of a constructivist view, and he was more of a moral relativist, which Branden, of course, with his objectivist philosophy, was not at all. So I think the main difference there is that emphasis on personal integrity, which Albert Ellis did not really emphasize uh, at all. So, and there's no doubt in my mind that as long as there is identification with thinking, that how you live is going to influence your reputation with yourself, and that's going to look like who you are unless you have some epiphanies into the nature of experience. So making the case, for example, Milton Erickson, the psychiatrist and hypnosis expert, medical doctor, he used to say that neurosis is the inability to communicate directly. And I think this is extremely true. That a lot of the symptoms that people have, their pains and their weird symptoms and their anxieties and stuff like that, are very often ways of indirectly, you know, setting boundaries and getting love and getting approval. And so learning to be more direct in your communication, learning to directly assert what you want, to communicate your boundaries, to live your values, that healthy uh, self-assertiveness, right, is so important to have a good life. The work of Dr. John Sarno, the foremost expert on chronic pain, he made the observation, and I think he's right, that a lot of chronic pain, if you look at who suffers, they tend to be either perfectionists, control freaks, people who put a lot of pressure on themselves to succeed and to be in control, heavy masturbators, as Ellis would say, but also these people pleasers, people who put tremendous pressure on themselves to be good human beings. And as a result of that, many of them will kind of appease. They'll self-sacrifice in an unhealthy way by putting other people's needs above their own all the time. And as a result of that, they tend to, instead of feeling their anger or other emotions that may threaten harmonious relationships, they develop symptoms. They develop chronic pain. As Gabor Mate would say, the body when the body says no. So if you look at the people who struggle with chronic pain, if you look at people who struggle with autoimmune disorders, for example, very common red thread here is that people have not learned to directly assert themselves. And there's often a low self-acceptance, a lot of shame, a lot of damning, a unwillingness or inability to be with their own inner life because it looks threatening. So where I think they're right, and where this is useful, is that I think that Ellis is right in that it's a mistake to rate yourself, your totality, and that you had better learn to the best of your ability to unconditionally accept yourself, but to rate your behaviors. Now that's difficult. That's swimming upstream. We It's not natural for people to do that. And I also strongly agree with Ellis that that tendency to masturbate is something that is so useful to help people to discover and to dispute and to challenge. And he would criticize Branden, Nathaniel Branden, and Ayn Rand, and rightly so, for being way too absolutistic. That Branden would tend to kind of more demand that therefore you have to be productive and you have to be responsible and you have to do all these things, right? Heavy masturbation. At the same time, pragmatically speaking, again, I think Brandon is right in that, again, as long as we think that we are a self, basically, we're going to naturally develop a reputation with ourselves, and how we live and to what extent we practice these pillars will have an effect on it. So, as another point here regarding integrity and living consciously and self assertiveness, there was a psychologist called James Penbaker who noticed that when prisoners confessed to crimes, even if they confessed the most heinous crimes, there was often a dramatic decrease in pain, flu, colds, chronic pain, better sleep, less depression, less anxiety in the weeks and months that followed. And he started doing this thing that he called the private confession, where he would get university students and psychotherapy clients to take something in their life that was a deeply held secret, something they were ashamed of, or something that really bothered them that they didn't want to look at, or a trauma, or something like that. And he had them spend 15 to 20 minutes per day, 4 days in a row, just writing about this, right? They never had to show it to anyone. And somewhere between 70 and 80%, and these are replicated studies, had the same type of results that the prisoners had. So this kind of shows that secrets are not necessarily that good for us. Not being willing to acknowledge and be with our inner experience, to not be conscious of it, to not self-express, so these are super important things. Now, pragmatically speaking, though, I mean, and this is an element that Ellis, admitted to not being necessarily that good at: unconditional other acceptance, right? The idea of like accepting the sinner, but not the sin. That you can judge and evaluate someone's behavior and their actions and stuff like that, but that you always seek to unconditionally accept the person. This is difficult to do. It's very difficult to do, and I agree with Ellis that it's worthwhile to. I mean, if you in your daily life can separate between what someone does, criticizing or disapproving their behavior, but not rating them as a human being, that's damned healthy, right? And something worth aiming for. I also wonder, like, because let's say someone does a crime. You're not sending the behavior to prison. You're sending the person to prison, right? So let's say you're dealing with someone in your life who displays, let's say, strong psychopathic tendencies. They lie, they cheat, they manipulate. They essentially live as a predatory parasite, with no conscience or no. This is, of course, painting an extreme picture, but let's say that you're dealing with someone like that. Of course, Ellis does not at any time say that you have to keep company with someone like that, but what would it mean in actuality to unconditionally accept a person like that? I don't know if Ellis ever really is that good at kind of flushing out the real life implications of, well, what does it mean? Can you push this? Can you push this too far? Ellis himself really had this theory tested, in the later aspects of his life when he discovered that certain members of his own institute, the Albert Ellis Institute, that he had donated millions of dollars to and built, that some people in the later time of his life, when his medical bills got huge, essentially the board expelled him, from his own institute, and they banned him from using the premises and for giving his talks, and acted in very unethical ways against Albert Ellis. Um, Maybe that had something to do with pushing unconditional other acceptance a bit too far. I mean, just in the same way that Nathaniel Branden argued that people will have a reputation with themselves. How you live and think. It's going to affect your psychology, your experience of yourself, right? So I mean, we are going to ultimately judge other people as trustworthy or decent or uh, yeah. What are the implications really of unconditional other acceptance if you really push that stuff to the hilt? But do your best, at least in your daily life, to separate between the behavior and the person. Do your best to practice unconditional self acceptance and unconditional life acceptance. And they were both good at essentially, helping helping people live responsibly and that sort of stuff. Although Ellis did so in less absolutistic terms. Now, here's something interesting also to look at. I think personally that one of the big challenges that we human beings face is confirmation bias. I think confirmation bias was probably extremely useful back in the day, 70,000 years ago on the East African savannah, where we lived a life of responding to very acute and concrete threats. Confirmation bias was probably extremely useful then. But if you look now today, we humans, our minds seems to be belief engines. And we seem to use our logic and reasoning mostly to justify what we already believe. And it's really hard for us to combat confirmation bias. And I remember speaking, more than a decade ago with a guy called Tore Sandberg here in Norway, who's a private investigator and journalist who has contributed to, at the time, 8 people who were innocently convicted of murder to get released from Norwegian prisons. And I asked him in this long conversation I had with him, I said, Tore, I'm wondering, in these cases where the wrong person has been in jail for 10 or 15 or 20 years, did anyone in the prosecution, judges, news editors, chiefs of police, ever apologize to the person, try to do anything to make life a bit less tragic? And he started laughing and he said, no, no one ever. That just doesn't happen. They do the opposite. They do what they can to cover up their mistakes and to not have to not have to deal with things. And I remember what he said. He said, remember, Jurgen, they're good people. They view themselves as good people. They're good people because they do good deeds. So admitting to their part of this would be devastating for them psychologically. So my big question is, in an effort to be more virtuous as a human being, to be that the exception, the judge or the police officer or the media journalist who actually cares enough about truth and justice that they would be willing to apologize or willing to do what they could to make things better, do you think it would be more likely for someone to act in accordance with that through the teachings of Nathaniel Branden or Albert Ellis. Here's the funny part. When I grew up, as I said, I was a huge fan of Nathaniel Branden's books. His books spoke to me. They spoke to my soul. No one wrote better about personal responsibility and integrity and that sort of stuff. But in later years, as I've read more about Nathaniel Branden, I think it's quite uncontroversial to say that, at least in the 60s and 70s, he seems to have matured and had a redemption of sorts, but that he was a liar and a cheat on steroids. He would betray the trusts of his patients. He would have sexual infidelities. He would lie and claim credit for stuff that wasn't his. He would treat other people extremely harshly and unjustly. So Branden could write about this with such profound clarity and be, at least early on in his life, a very poor representative of this. Ellis, on the other hand, if you look at him not talking that much about personal integrity and being a moral relativist, when I read his autobiography, I discovered that he had fathered three illegitimate children with his ex-wife. Long story short, his ex-wife had a child with her new husband who seemed to be a bit retarded initially, but who ended up doing just fine. But she was convinced that that was the genetics of the husband, and she wanted more kids, at least one more child. And she was convinced that Albert Ellis had good genes. So she and Ellis came up with this plan that Ellis would father the child because he enjoyed the sex and he agreed at the time that he had good genes. And so they would deceive the husband. So Ellis actually fathered over three children over more than a decade that were not his. And the wife would trick her current husband to believe that Ellis's kids were actually his kids, right? And that's a betrayal that's quite, you know, and to do this on three occasions, three different children over more than a decade, I think at least is a big moral and ethical lapse in Albert Ellis. He writes about this in his autobiography and kind of discusses whether he was moral or immoral for doing this. I'll give it to both Albert Ellis and Nathaniel Branden. They were quite, if you look at Ellis's autobiography, to admit that and to write about that, such levels of honesty about his own dishonesty, that's kind of special. And if you look at Branden's autobiography, in many parts of it, he kind of comes off as the villain. Now, here's where I think that they're both wrong. So, I mean, if you look at Nathaniel Branden's teachings, which were heavily based upon Ayn Rand's philosophy, Ayn Rand said that there's no emotional shoulds, and that you should only, kind of judge yourself for your volitional thinking, not your kind of involuntary emotional life. But here's the big problem with the whole project, right? There really is no self. And this is the problem with Branden's analogy that I alluded to earlier with physical health versus self-esteem. Sure, you can feel fatigue. You can feel shortness of breath, but you never really experience a self. You experience thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions, right? But in your actual experience, there is no self. The self is inferred by thinking. It is not actually experienced. So Branden then kind of makes this mistake where, your deliberate, volitional, conscious thinking and acting, that's kind of you. The capacity to be the thinker, to in his words, be conscious. That's kind of the self. But the problem is that there is no thinker. You can you can do this experiment yourself. You can search your experience, and you'll fail to find a thinker anywhere. There is no thinker behind the thoughts. There is no thinker behind the thinking. There's just the thinking, right? Now, does volitional and kind of non-volitional thinking feel different? Sure. Are there different neurological activity going on? Sure. But the reality is, what we call volition, agents, the sense of agency, uh, this also just emerges in the same way that the sun and the colors and every other process of life emerges. There's no one doing it. This is a trick of thinking, right? And also, so the big mistake here is the identification with volition, or that inner voice of the mind, or that thinking process, to kind of think that that's who we are, and to rate our let's call it self-respect, or value as based upon that, right? Sure, there's self-referential thinking, but there's no thinker. And all the self-referential thinking and feeling seems to refer to an entity like self. But again, if you look for it, it's nowhere to be found in experience. It's inferred by thought. So the idea of accepting yourself or rating yourself is a bit like accepting or rating Santa Claus or Batman at the end of the day. Branden really believed in a self. Ellis seemed to kind of partially believe in it. He viewed it more as a construction of sorts, right? So, of course, if there's the realization that there really is no such thing as a self, there really is no entity, then this whole self-esteem thing becomes quite mute. And also feelings of shame and being responsible, right? Now, somewhat ironically, though, if you're not the thinker of thoughts, you're not responsible for them. There is no one to be responsible in that sense. But it makes no sense to blame anyone else either. It's just life unfolding. And responsibility is kind of like a social contract. We hold each other accountable and responsible, right? Um, Now, something else that Branden, and also I think Ellis to some extent, they didn't distinguish between, let's say, being and thinking necessarily. So Branden had this idea that the key to man's nature is that consciousness is volitional, and that the self is kind of that which thinks or chooses to be conscious or not. But there's no one that chooses to be conscious or not. You could say that volition, precedes action in a sense. But and he would also write about man or people being conscious, right? And that consciousness can't be aware of itself, and therefore the fact of being conscious presupposes, an other. But this might be the trap of automatically believing in the tenets of materialism, because if you truly look at experience, it's all consciousness. At the level of experience, there is no experience outside of consciousness. There is no other in that sense. The thinking process divides experience into separate objects and separate people and all sorts of stuff. And that's useful and necessary, right? But consciousness itself is not a self. It's not an I. This is the product of thinking. And also, is it really true that individuals or animals have consciousness? Or are what we call human beings and animals expressions of consciousness? Does a human being or a self really have consciousness? Or are conscious? Or is it more that consciousness is aware of itself? Because in experience, the Jurgen character, the I, the self-referential thinking, kind of comes and goes. But whenever it dissolves or disappears, being still remains. And that has to mean that the story of Jurgen, the story of this character, the self-referential thinking, is not essential to what I fundamentally am. So here's a nice here's a nice book recommendation around that. Take a look at Bernardo Kastrup's Why Materialism is Baloney. Now, whether materialism is right or idealism is right or panpsychism, this is all above my pay scale, so to speak. But I think it's important to not automatically take for granted the tenets of materialism, which both Branden and Ellis seem to do. Because materialism seems to presuppose that what's fundamentally real is matter, and that consciousness or subjectivity, the experience of life itself, somehow emerges out of some configuration of matter. That dead matter somehow creates the experience of being alive or life itself. And there's in science currently not even a good hypothesis on the table in terms of how that would be possible. So you never really experience matter because matter technically means outside of consciousness or separate from consciousness. Everything you ever experience is consciousness. It's in consciousness, so to speak, not outside of consciousness. So it is kind of bizarre to assume that the only thing you really truly experience, which is consciousness and its expressions, right? That's somehow an illusion or not real, but that the thing you never experience, matter, separate from consciousness or not consciousness, something you never actually experience, is the only thing that's real, and somehow the source of the only thing you ever experience, which is somehow not real. All right. I hope this was useful. Thanks for listening. Know that I see clients from all over the world. If you're curious to book a session with me, you can reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. If you're watching this in February 2025, I have a masterclass on how to work with depressed clients coming up. Starts March 12th. You can hit the seminar page at provocativehypnosis.com if you're curious to know more. All right. Again, thanks for listening.